Good morning. On behalf of the director, Susan Weber, it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Bard Graduate Center, those of you watching on Zoom and those of you here in the room. As an institute that studies the past through things, we are here acutely aware of place. And where we are now, West 86th Street on the Upper West Side, was once next door to Seneca Village, home to freed Blacks and immigrant Irish, before being claimed by eminent domain by the city of New York and buried in 1857 in the making of Central Park. And before that, it was the Mannahatta of Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral home of the Lenni Lenape peoples, for whom it so remains. Or in the words of the poet Campbell McGrath, acorns, tossing them into the Hudson River from a bench, as I did when I was Peter Stuyvesant, when I was Walt Whitman, when we were of the Lenape and Broadway our hunting trail. Then the deer vanished, the docks decayed, the towers fell. The African graveyard was buried beneath concrete as the memory of slavery has been obscured by metonymy and willful amnesia. The poem from which these lines come, The Ruins of Yankee Stadium, and I have to say proudly, the poem was commissioned by the BGC for one of its publications before being published in the New Yorker, points towards the passage of time. And time, as the French novelist Marguerite Yourcenar writes, and every conservator anywhere knows, is the mighty sculptor. Almost 10 years ago, the project we are bringing to a conclusion now, Cultures of Conservation, was launched into public life in this room with a story, and I will retell it again right now. In 1872, when George Smith read the cuneiform tablets of Gilgamesh containing the story of the flood in the British Museum, he rose from the table and ran around the room while stripping off his clothes. We may have some eureka-like moment here over the next 2 days. I certainly hope we'll have something like that, but I don't think, and maybe I hope that we won't celebrate it in quite the same way. But it is a good story all the same, even more because it generally leaves out one crucial fact, and that is that the person who handed the tablets to Smith and who cleaned them and made them ready to read was the British Museum's conservator, Robert Reddy. BGC's Cultures of Conservation initiative focuses on developing and exploring that underdeveloped relationship between the conservator and the scholar of the material past, bringing the knowledge and perspectives of conservators about material things into the conversations of historians, philosophers, archaeologists, anthropologists, and of course, art historians. Our ambition in creating Cultures of Conservation was to bring together the humanists who ask questions about the material world and the conservators and conservation scientists and their extraordinarily precise answer-giving technologies. I want now to recognize and acknowledge with gratitude for their visionary support, Mariette Westermann and Alison Gilchrist, who were, respectively at the time, Vice President and Associate Program Officer for Art History, Conservation, and Museums at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. In 2017, we turned Cultures of Conservation into the research project Conserving Active Matter, articulated on 4 axes: materials, history, philosophy, indigenous ontologies. This project in turn presented its findings in a book and exhibition of the same name. You are welcome to walk down the street during the lunch break to visit it. Just tell the person at the gallery desk that you're here at the symposium. And those of you out in Zoom land have until July 10th to see it in our galleries. One of our basic points is that a culture's conservation practices follow from certain fundamental shapes of thinking. In the case of conservation as practiced in Europe and North America, from the time of its professional inception around 1900 and up to the present, it has generally been a hierarchicalized dualism: spirit and matter, subject and object, mind and body, active and passive, being and becoming. And I don't think I have to tell you which of these pairs was always deemed the higher in status. Cultures of Conservation, Conserving Active Matter, brought to light connections between, for example, views of matter found among the indigenous peoples of the American Southwest and those of South Asia, Japan, and the wider Buddhist sphere, but also connections back to the very beginnings of European philosophy in pre-Socratic Ionia and through magic, alchemy, the philosophy of Schelling up to the age of Darwin and Marx. In other words, paying attention to different ways of thinking about conservation can help us draw a new map of intellectual history. This interpenetration is what we are trying to grasp with our term conservation thinking. This conference, like the exhibition down the street, is not about conservation as a collection of treatments, techniques, or material challenges. It is rather about the way those material challenges are entry points into a range of big questions about time, memory, human need, and object-subject entanglement that are actually embedded in the conservator's work. I could have said philosophical questions, but I don't want to choose a term of art already with its associations for us to undo over the course of the next 2 days. Instead of redefining old terms, we propose to use new ones without the associations, untested, with risk, but also open. By conservation thinking, we mean the range of intellectual responses, some of which take practical form, others literary reflection, but all of which, bundled together, could be said to constitute the thinking world of the conservator. Ours was always cultures of conservation in plural, and conserving active matter has reminded us of our beginnings with a desire to bring the wider world of conservation into a single conversation. In a way, our model could be Goethe's early 19th century vision of a world literature. So let me quote from a letter of his from June 11th, 1827. He writes, "Poetry is cosmopolitan, and the more interesting, the more it shows its nationality. Replace poetry with conservation, and we have the reason for being here these 2 days." Let me give one specific example. The Shinto Grand Shrine at Ise was, for many of us in the group, a touchstone. Its rebuilding every 20 years seemed to touch on and be an alternative to so many fundamental ideas about what is the object, about aura, about authenticity, about the difference between restoration and conservation. Careful readers of Chris Wood's forgery fiction Replica will recognize here the logic of what he calls substitution, and note with familiarity that this approach was just as common an intellectual framing in Europe before the Renaissance. It is, he writes, a peculiarity, his word, of post-Renaissance Western culture to insist, and I quote, on the tight causal link between the physical artifact and the life world, close quotes. This is why cultures of conservation exists, because conservation is cosmopolitan, and the more interesting, the more it shows its nationality. The next 2 days will offer 2 different explorations, one focusing on Japan, one on India. They could be treated as 2 separate one-day events, and indeed each will be published as a separate volume in BGC's Cultural Histories of the Material World book series. But they could also be viewed Goethe-like as a long, meandering, but single story, with common chapters devoted to, for example, Buddhism, wood, traditional techniques of preservation, performance, ritual as preservation, and the role of institutions in creating norms for preservation. I want to pause here and thank my colleagues who ran the different working groups in this project and who then served as a curatorial committee for the making of the concluding exhibition. Ivan Gaskell, Aaron Glass, Meredith Lin, Jennifer Mass, Itai Weinrib. And a special shout out to Sun Kai Po, lead curator of Conserving Active Matter, and Andrew W. Mellon Fellow these past 3 years. I also want to extend profound thanks to the people who actually made this day possible. Laura Minsky, Associate Director of Public Humanities Plus Research, for her meticulous care of details. Jen Ha, Assistant Director of Research Programs, for her work on site preparing for today. Jocelyn Lau, our designer, for the materials we have in our hands, and Maggie Walter for the materials on our screens. I also want to thank the people who physically created, prepare, and organize the space in which we will spend the next 2 days, and also organize the food for these times. James Congregan, Head of Buildings and Facilities, Ken Yi Sun, Facilities Operations Manager, Jose Oliveira, Facilities Coordinator, and Enrique Angeles, Ivan Ospina, K.R. Patterson, Ravichan Manaram, Charles Watt, and Gilberto Rivera. My deepest thanks to all of them. I also want to offer a special thanks today to Yukio Lippert, who contributed enormously to the planning of this event, so much so, in fact, that it only seems fair to acknowledge him as its joint organizer. Thank you, Yukio.